Hi everyone. In this video, I'd like to talk about how do we say no when we can't say no. So this is part of my defences series. This is number 4. And it's really helpful to understand what kind of different defences we use so we can understand ourselves better. And that's half the challenge when we're on our way to coming from a dysfunctional childhood. So let's have a look at an article on my website, which is called How Do We Say No When We Can't Say No? And my website is called childrenofnarcissists.org.uk. Let's go and have a look. How do we say no when we can't say no? Learning to be compliant and agreeable. When we have grown up in a narcissistic family, we have been conditioned into being compliant, passive and agreeable. And we will therefore often struggle to not only know what our wants and needs are, but to be able to assert them, to be able to say no to people when we don't want to do something, and to be able to generally live our lives in the way that we would like to. We may be aware of this consciously to some extent, or we may be largely unaware of these underlying dynamics in our psyches. So there's an article on my website about behavioural conditioning, which speaks about the different ways we get conditioned in the early years. If you'd like to go and have a look at that, I'll put a link in the description. Our behaviours are conditioned through reward and punishment. We are rewarded for passive behaviours, for being how the narcissistic parent wants us to be, for mirroring and admiring them. And we are punished for being assertive through criticism, silent treatments, and rages. This shapes the way we react to things, and we develop an intricate set of coping mechanisms, and we move away from trying to be our real self and towards being an adapted version of ourselves. Moving towards an adapted self is a process of disowning the parts of ourselves that we come to believe are unacceptable. And it's shaped by the need for love and acceptance that we're striving for to get from our parents or parental figures. And we become motivated by our fears. So a big driving force in our life is fears and the things that we're most frightened of, which are things like being abandoned, rejected, criticised, shunned, all the things that happen in a narcissistic family when the children don't toe the line, so to speak. As we know, in a narcissistic family, it's my way or the highway from the narcissist's point of view. So in explaining this idea of the adapted self and the real self, let's have a look at an animation. The idea that this animation is explaining is the basis of all psychological theory in a way, which is that we have our true self, our real self, underlying, and then to some extent we suppress parts of ourselves and we want to fit in with society. Some people are quite aware of this, some people aren't, but we can put it on a spectrum. So generally people are like this. When we've come from a dysfunctional and or abusive background, then we're going to be more towards the more extreme end of that spectrum of the ability to be ourselves or not. But most anxiety is caused by the gap between those two things. So people and the real self that they want to be, and this self that they feel is expected of them by others or by themselves. So this idea of the real self and the adapted self is part of most psychological theory, and what I'm going to talk about here specifically comes from a book by James F. Masterson, who is a psychiatrist who specialised in narcissistic and borderline personality disorder. One of his books for the layman was called A Search for the Real Self, Unmasking the Personality Disorders of Our Age, which he wrote in 1988. And that book, you can find it on Amazon for around £10, something like that. So I'm going to read a few extracts from that book where he's talking about this concept that I'm going to show you now so that it will make more sense. So we have this idea of the real self. This is how we're born with our inherent character, which has got our own preferences, talents and personality traits, characteristics. We're all so unique. So we're born our unique selves. And then society and parents and other figures around us shape our characters as we get older. And so we become a version of ourselves which is perhaps different from how it would have been. And that's not to say we're all born perfect, by the way. We're all born with positive character traits and more negative character traits. And part of life can be striving to be a better version of ourselves. So we're not all born perfect, but we are born with an inherent character. But this is heavily shaped by the environment we find ourselves in. So if it's a negative, hostile environment, then this is going to have serious consequences for how we can function in the world. So let's have a look then at this animation. So first of all, somebody starts off as their real self. Then they become an adapted version of themselves, and that real version of themselves becomes suppressed to a certain extent. For some people, parts of ourselves can be completely unconscious, buried in our subconscious, and we're only familiar with the adapted self. Sometimes there can be quite a battle going on in the mind. So we're trying to suppress things, avoid things in our internal world, but they get triggered or they leak out in lots of different ways. And there can be a belief deep down that if people knew the real me, they would reject me. So a fundamental core belief that keeps that real self suppressed. So what else keeps the real self suppressed? So James Masterson talks about the 6 emotions. He calls them the 6 horsemen of the psychic apocalypse, actually. And they are despair, hopelessness, rage, panic, guilt, and emptiness. So what happens then, the cycle that ends up happening for most people that find themselves in this position of having a suppressed, or as he calls it, an impaired real self. So it's trying to become its real self, or it's like a flower that always wants to grow and develop. And it's actually a constant battle for us to stop it coming out. So what can happen is the real self tries to express wants and needs because our own unique self wants to become itself. So these wants and needs will try to come out and try to get themselves fulfilled. And then what this can trigger is one of those 6 emotions, which then comes up and pushes down that attempt at self-activation, at getting the wants and needs met. So the real self tries to activate, those emotions are triggered, and they, along with the adapted self, these parts of us are triggered, and then they come up and they suppress the real self back down again. So this is a system of defenses that we have. The adapted self keeps them in place, and that's the version of ourselves we present to the world. And then the real self is trying to become itself underneath, trying to grow. But then emotions, as the language of the body, we feel bad and we don't want to feel bad. So it can feel safer to suppress that real self and stay in the adapted self. So it's all about what feels safer for the person. So I'd like to read from James Masterson's book, The Search from the Real Self. In chapter 4, he's talking about the fear of abandonment. So this is a huge issue for people that have come from a family with narcissistic parents. So he's given examples of 4 people who are in their adapted selves, and they're talking to him about it, about how they feel so hurt and lost and helpless, unable to cope with reality, adrift, alone, no sense of worth or meaning, feeling of being deserted, kills me, I can't work, trying to work is tempting fate, risky, treacherous. I can almost hear voices telling me it's wrong to be myself. I have to block them out, or I think I'm dying, so I give up. I feel completely abandoned and I want to yell, help me out. Where is everybody? But the voices yell back, he's crazy. So it's really dark, deep stuff. that's going on for people from this kind of background. Another person says, I've been frightened into thinking that growing up is wrong. I think I'm destined to die because I'm growing up. I can envision no life except the way I lived as a girl at home. I'm an empty shell that should be filled with grown-up attitudes, but I can't put any in without breaking it, breaking who I am. I feel guilty and frightened. So James Masterson calls this the abandonment depression, which is a mixture of those feelings that people feel so crippled by as they struggle with this internal battle between their real self and their adapted self. So he says then, how can abandonment depression drive people into states of such unbearable loneliness, helplessness and depression that they are unable to recognise themselves as valuable human beings? How can intelligent and well-meaning men and women buy the false self's bill of goods? So he's calling it the false self, but I think I prefer adapted self. That avoiding the abandonment depression at all costs takes precedence over leading a balanced and rewarding and creative life. So he then goes on to say, abandonment depression is actually an umbrella term beneath which ride the 6 horsemen of the psychic apocalypse: depression, panic, rage, guilt, helplessness, which is also hopelessness, and emptiness, which is void. Like the 4 horsemen of the Bible, conquest, war, famine and death, they wreak havoc across the psychic landscape, leaving pain and terror in their wake. No wonder that many people prefer the unholy alliance with a strong false defender that can ward off the psychic havoc these horsemen strew in their path. The intensity and immediacy of these 6 feelings can become unbearable in people with a severely impaired sense of self. So when we are not encouraged and nurtured to be ourselves as young children, then we don't have a strong sense of self. It's fragmented and we don't have a strong foundation on which to stand. So we do have this impaired sense of self. To these people, the real self is under constant attack, and a siege mentality clouds their ability to perceive themselves and the world in realistic terms. So when we are living in our defences, we are living in a biased view of the world, which is slanted towards the psychological warfare where we've come from. But when we move out of that home and into the real world, there are still narcissistic type people around, but we tend to end up behaving as if everyone is dangerous, everyone is narcissistic, we can't trust anyone. So our bias then helps to protect us in the way that we believe that the world is a really dangerous place and we need to protect ourselves from feeling like we could fall apart or be annihilated or fall down and not be able to get back up again. All these fears of what can happen to us psychologically. So it's a fear of that psychological collapse, because when we've come from a narcissistic family, quite honestly, many people have been in a place where they've felt almost destroyed or almost defeated. Many people have tried to commit suicide. Many people have suicidal feelings throughout their lives. Other people don't. And then other people have passive suicidal thoughts, such as, I wish I didn't have to wake up. I can't cope. I can't go on. Is life always going to be like this? So it's a really painful way to live. In the eyes of the besieged self, the world, one's closest relationships, one's own body can become the enemy. The world appears to be a hostile environment, so alien and threatening that the self is like a stranger in a strange land. Uncertain and ignorant of the standard techniques that others use to cope with reality. Relationships are stifling, engulfing, or always on the verge of breakup, leaving the self hurt and abandoned. Everyone dominated by a false or adapted self knows each of these painful feelings to some degree. They create a panicky state of helplessness, of being out of control, and an inexorable need to feel protected and safe again. The false self unfailingly comes to the rescue, but the payment for feeling safe is the failure of the real self to develop autonomy. So this is the battle. The false self rescues us from those awful feelings, but how we pay is that we can't become our real selves. So really we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, aren't we? So it's either go through the pain of processing all those things to be able to become our real self, or we stay in the false self and it's ongoing suffering. And it's not easy. And going into therapy and processing all the trauma that we're carrying, or all the dysfunction and unhealthy coping mechanisms that we're carrying can be painful. But then at least when we come out of the other side and we are in our real selves, then life is much better. And I'm pretty sure I've got a video which goes through the 10 characteristics of the real self that James Masterson talks about. And it's the ideal place where we would all love to be. I'll look up that video after I finish this because I can't remember the name of it. And I'll put a link in the description so that you can go and watch that if you wish to. James Masterson also lists those 10 characteristics of the real self in this book, The Search for the Real Self, if you'd like to get the book. Let's have a look then at those emotions. The lack of support for the emerging self leads to depression. Different people describe feeling depressed in different ways, but in normal states of depression, we can usually sleuth out the causes and handle the depression by the successful tactics we have learned to use in the past. We do things to get our mind off it, take a walk, go shopping, read a book, turn on television, turn to someone else. We need cheering up, and our real selves know ways to go about it. Sometimes we just have to wait it out, knowing it will pass. It is a mark of maturity that we can get through periods of depression either on our own or with the help of someone who understands us and has our best interests at heart. The experience of the abandonment depression is far more serious and devastating than the forms of depression that come and go in the course of our daily lives. In the throes of the abandonment depression, a person will feel that part of his very self is lost or cut off from the supplies necessary to sustain life. Many patients describe this in graphic physical terms, such as losing an arm or leg, being deprived of oxygen, or being drained of blood. At the darkest level of this depression, a person can despair of ever recovering her real self, and thoughts of suicide are not uncommon. In therapy, the first expressions of depression are usually not so grim. Patients toss off their situation with statements like, "Life is boring," "I'm numb," "There are no feelings in me," "I always feel down even when I'm doing things I ordinarily like doing a lot." The common characteristic is that they seem not to derive any satisfaction from their lives. So this is really interesting, especially the comment about life being boring. So many people feel this at their core. So some people put it down to being used to a level of chaos. For me, I think it's because people are so uncomfortable in their own skin that it's a sense of irritation, actually. That's low-level anger, boredom can be classed as. And as James Masterson says, it's expressing that abandonment depression. Even when they have free time to do what they want, none of the plans or activities they occasionally dream about spark their interest. Things they thought they would do, given the chance, now seem unexciting, meaningless, or too threatening. The numbness is pervasive and unending, and they can't seem to break out of it. On the surface, it appears to be a strong attack of the blahs. But the blahs alone don't bring people into therapy. There are deeper rumblings than the patient or the therapist can detect in the initial sessions. The roots of depression push further into the past than seems apparent. In time, the true sources, eating away inside, make themselves known. But initially, they are well defended by the false self. So interesting. So people do come into therapy and there are so many layers to uncover and there's so much down there. But don't let that worry you. That might sound like it's impossible to work through, but it's not. It does take time. It does take months or even, a couple of years, a few years, but you can find your way out. Depression and rage ride in tandem. As depression intensifies and comes to the surface, so does anger. At first, most patients cannot pinpoint the reasons why they are angry. The target of their rage is rather diffuse and projected on outside sources. People describe themselves as being angry at life or the world in general, or just angry. A mature man or woman can recognize these and control the angry response. However, in these patients, life's ordinary frustrations are used as a target upon which is projected a deep inner rage. Anger that is part of the abandonment depression, however, has more damaging consequences. And then he goes on to speak about a lady who can't deal with her anger. She was helpless in dealing with her anger and turned it against herself. Their anger is long-lasting, building up from painful childhood experiences that may not be easily recalled because they are too solidly defended against. The more depressed a patient becomes, the angrier he gets, and eventually the real seeds of the anger are uncovered. Incidents in the first years of life when the real self was trying to emerge and failed to do so. Rage and fear lead to panic. We have all experienced it at one time or another. The normal amounts of panic are helpful for survival. As part of the abandonment depression, fear and panic operate on a more insidious level, arising not from legitimate and present dangers, but from an abiding and unconscious fear. The false self plays its deceptive role, ostensibly protecting us, but doing so in a way that is programmed to keep us fearful of being abandoned, losing support, not being able to cope on our own, and not being able to be alone. Panic feeds on the fear that we cannot express our anger over abandonment. It can be a claustrophobic strangling of energies, a tightening up of options. Either we express our anger and risk losing the love of others, or we deny the anger in order to remain in the helpless state of dependency and hold on to others. As the panic grows, patients report that it feels like facing death or actually being killed. Fear plays an important role in the lives of people dominated by a false self. In the 70s, I was amazed at how many patients were mesmerised by the then popular novel The Godfather. Of course, as a bestseller, the book appealed to many people who were not victims of a false self, but the degree to which patients were attracted to the characters and problems in the book was a clue for me to something serious going on in their own lives. The book, describing the mafia's use of terror and fear of death to discipline and enforce compliance, portrayed in concrete terms a key theme that dominated the patients' own stories about their lives. Like the haunted and stalked victims of the mafia's vengeance, my patients clearly understood the score. Comply and you receive rewards. If you do not comply, you are killed. A person living with a death threat, or what is perceived as a death threat, hanging over his head, necessarily leads a fearful life in which every move to express himself, to allow his real self to emerge, is accompanied by the need to look over his shoulder in fear and panic. Guilt is the fifth column behind the patient's front line of defences. The Horsemen guilt is not the reasonable guilt that a person feels when he genuinely does something he believes wrong. Guilt that is appropriate for an injury or harm caused to another. Appropriate guilt for the right reasons and in the right degree oils the wheels of society and keeps us civilised. The Horseman guilt is another matter. It is fed by the guilt we internalise in early childhood from the disapproval expressed by the mother for self-actualisation or individuation. So this is us trying to assert ourselves, become ourselves, and express our wants and needs. It is then reinforced later in childhood and in adolescence. Even after striking out on our own, a strong reprimanding voice fixed in the psyche, reminiscent of parents, teachers, and authority figures from the past, can echo down the corridors of time in our daily lives when we entertain those special thoughts and wishes we know would, in the past, elicit disapproval. The real self's genuine urges, however, starting a new career, beginning a relationship with someone, moving out of town, spending an evening away from the family, spending a little extra money on a new hobby or pastime, should not produce guilt feelings. When the false self is solidly in control, those harmless natural desires for self-expression can trigger the voice of warning, the rebukes, the disapproval we have kept locked in our psyche over the years. In people who have a strong sense of their real selves, such undertakings do not provoke guilt, or if they do, the real self calmly recognises it as an echo of mother's or father's disapproving voice, and perhaps even laughs at it for coming up inappropriately. Operating from their real selves, such people put aside the incipient guilty feeling and proceed as they wish. For people with an impaired real self, however, the guilt produced by this warning can be as paralysing as it was when they were 5 years old. They feel guilty about that part of themselves that wants to individuate. Not being able to face up to the internalised guilt trip, these individuals will suppress making any moves in the forbidden direction and resort to the old familiar clinging behaviour that they remember made them feel safe and good years ago. And by safe and good, that means not feeling bad. In some cases, especially among adolescents and young adults, clinging behaviour may be directed to the actual mother, which reinforces all the more vividly a person's sense that she is not strong enough to carve out a healthy, independent lifestyle. In other cases, the clinging may no longer be to the real mother, but to another person who represents security and approval. In effect, we want someone to take care of us like a parent, whether that person wants to or not. In either case, the false self argues convincingly that clinging is the only reliable strategy to avoid feeling guilty. So some people cling, some people avoid others as much as they can, some people cling to a partner and avoid everyone else. We're all going to have our own unique style of these kinds of clinging behaviours. Helplessness springs from the patient's inability to activate his impaired real self to deal with these painful feelings. Everyone is helpless at one time or another. Helplessness as part of the abandonment depression, however, is abiding and total. Although specific incidents can trigger it, it is not caused by the specific incidents, but persists like a gloomy backdrop to life, casting a pall over most activities and life situations. Unlike a healthy man or woman who says, well, this is one of those situations at which I'm not very good, the false self says, you are totally helpless and good for nothing. Some people's false self will actually lure them into drugs, alcohol, or abusive behaviours. Others sink into passivity or dead-end activities such as excessive daydreaming, mindless shopping, overeating, or unfilling liaisons. Some will cling to people, familiar places or objects such as furniture, clothing, art, or daily schedules and routines. Their primary purpose is to avoid the fear associated with independence and self-expression, fear of the abandonment depression. So these are all different coping mechanisms that we'll have. We'll have addictive coping mechanisms. This is also how we manage our nervous system to calm everything down, because we're often in a triggered state of feeling hyper or hypo-aroused. So we either can feel anxious or we can feel flat and low. So that's The Search for the Real Self from James Masterson, and one of my favourite books in the world. So let's go back to the article. Subconscious defences. Many of our ways of coping will be subconscious as they are defences. Defences work by us not knowing we have them. We have to believe they are true. There may be some awareness in some cases. For example, if we're a daily drinker and we're drinking to manage our emotions, to numb things out, even though we may tell ourselves we drink to relax, there may be a vague awareness that there is an issue. We may tell ourselves something like, I probably do drink too much, but it's not that bad. It's not like I wake up and drink vodka. Other defences may be completely subconscious, and there can be many underlying fears which drive our defences. So we've looked at those in James Marston's book there. Why do we fear saying no? We fear saying no because to say no means to assert our own needs and wants, which we have been conditioned against doing. To do this feels dangerous and it can have serious consequences, and it will begin to feel natural and more comfortable to be passive and uncomfortable to be assertive. There are fears of rejection and abandonment, the consequences of displeasing others and not meeting the needs of others, and therefore we feel like we're letting them down. These fears should not be underestimated. We fear making others feel bad. We over-identify or over-empathize with others, and this stops us from saying no. We may be subservient to others as we fear our partner will leave us, for example, or that we will get fired from our jobs or end up homeless. So we can be very compliant at work. If we live with people, we might be very people-pleasing because we fear conflict with them. If we live in rented accommodation, we might not even want to complain about anything that's wrong in the house, for example, because we fear that we will end up being thrown out of the house, which is something that happens a lot for people that come from narcissistic families. Why can't we say no? How our defenses work. As our self is becoming an adapted version of itself, it learns to use the best defensive response through something called procedural or implicit memory. Implicit memory is related to unconscious memories, such as the ability to perform actions automatically, make connections, and respond to stimuli. For example, the ability to ride a bike is an unconscious skill once learned, and our defensive responses are the same. So it's something automatic and we don't need to think about it. Memories of feelings of helplessness, unanswered cries for help and attention, and feelings of fear surrounding their frightening caregivers are encoded in the body, in the nervous system, and in the emotions. Procedural memories are not experienced as memory, but as reactions, feelings, strong mood states, and dysregulated emotional states. So important to know that so much of what we feel are these automatic reactions from procedural memory. They're a body memory of the unprocessed trauma that we're carrying. I know some people don't like the word trauma, it feels a bit strong. Some people might prefer emotional baggage, mightn't they? So unprocessed trauma for some and unprocessed emotional baggage for others. We learn over time that it is not in our best interest to say no and assert ourselves, and this becomes an ingrained implicit body memory. This means that we will be triggered when put on the spot, and we will go into a submissive defense, which is people-pleasing, and where we can't say no or we struggle to say no. So let's say a co-worker asks you to go out for a drink with them and you don't really want to. You're going to feel put on the spot and then go into this defensive mode. So that's the trigger, and then your defensive mode will be don't say no. There can be serious outcomes from that. They'll be angry, they'll reject you, they'll speak badly about you. Lots of thoughts can be running through our mind. But if you struggle to say no, you're going to say perhaps, yes, I will, I'd love to. Or you're going to say something like, oh, maybe, I'm not sure, I'll find out. And then you might go along anyway, or you might make some kind of excuse to not go, or you may even pretend to be sick and not even go to work on that day. That's extreme, but anything can happen in these situations because underneath it feels incredibly serious, even if we can't feel that intensely on the surface. Some people feel it more intensely, some people feel less intensely. Our first port of call, we don't know, we want to say no. We will develop behavioural patterns of putting others first, ourselves last, and we may not be fully in touch with the fact we may want to say no. We may think, I just really like doing things for people, I'm laid back, I'm nice, which may be true, but if we only do for others and don't really do for ourselves, this may be a clue that we are in a defence. We may have beliefs like it's selfish to not help others, or it's selfish to not go along with others, be agreeable with other people, be compliant. Many of us have a harsh inner critic or inner drill sergeant, which keeps our needs and wants down. It tells us how pathetic we are or similar, And this makes us more submissive and helps us to go along with others. So if we reframe it as a defense, it helps us even though it doesn't feel like it's helping us at times. It stops us from feeling self-compassion, which, should we feel it, would make us want to strive towards good things for ourselves, and we would believe that we are as important as other people. Self-compassion feels dangerous. Some people might talk about it like it feels embarrassing or pathetic or weird or uncomfortable or ridiculous. So it's interesting how we might feel about being compassionate towards ourselves. It feels dangerous and is out of the question for many until they start to recover from the dysfunction. Some people can take months or years to even start to feel self-compassion. Some people do have some elements of it all along. Again, everyone's different. Our second port of call, we want to say no, but can't. Some people may find that they are unable to physically say no, even when they are aware they want to. So some people might even go on a date with someone because they prefer to do that than hurt the person's feelings by not going. And then some people might meet up with people like the colleague from work that they don't want to meet up with because they, again, don't want to hurt their feelings. And there are many ways we can avoid being put in a position where we say no. And these can be things like females might dress in a masculine way. This can deflect romantic interest and competition from other females. We may dress in a way that is unattractive in general. By being late often or being unreliable, we can put others off asking us to do things for them. We may be ditzy or incompetent as a way of not being asked to do things. Or we may believe that we're ditzy and incompetent because we've been put down so many times by our narcissistic family. There can be many reasons underlying lots of these behaviours. We may avoid people as much as possible so they can't ask things of us. We may drink a lot or take a lot of drugs, and this can keep others away from us. We may gain weight, not look after ourselves, or try to make ourselves unattractive to keep potential romantic partners away. We may create arguments with people close to us, which helps to create emotional and physical distance for us as we can then storm off, or the other person can storm off. So we can leave the situation. We may say maybe when we want to say no and hope it will be left at that. We may make passive-aggressive comments. So we try to express ourselves in that way because we can't do it in an assertive, direct way. We may use anger to create distance. Anger pushes people away. We may go away for holidays like Christmas so we can avoid others and escape invitations. We may pretend to be ill to get out of social engagements, and we may actually physically feel ill to get out of social engagements, but it's psychosomatic, and we might feel better quite quickly after we don't feel that we have to go to that engagement anymore. So many of these are going to be very subconscious. So it's just something we do. It's us, that's just me, is what we're going to think. But actually, if we can go down the layers and process what's happened to us and what's going on for us, we might find that lots of those behaviours are actually defences. How do we learn to say no? Learning to say no and learning to set boundaries is going to be one of the hardest challenges we face, as it means undoing years of conditioning and challenging many of our core beliefs. We need to change our relationship with ourselves, and any underlying fear needs to subside. So we need to lose our phobia of being our real self and of feeling those feelings that protect us from becoming our real self. But as we process the trauma, those fears do subside because we understand ourselves more and we understand what happened more. We need to get to know ourselves and to like ourselves enough that the old ways of being are no longer comfortable and no longer needed. So how do we do this? We need to develop our self-awareness, be mindfully curious about why we do the things that we do, get to know our triggers and what our triggered responses feel like. This helps us to understand ourselves, and self-compassion develops out of that understanding. We will then be in a place where we feel we are worth treating well. We say yes and no when we want to, but also balance this with compromising with others when needed and go along with things we may not want to. We balance our own needs with the needs of others. So this is the ideal where we will be when we're psychologically healthy and we're living in our real self rather than in our adapted self, or false self as James Masterson calls it. And a little note here is that some people who are used to you not setting boundaries may like the relationship that way and may not take to the new you. Be prepared for others to possibly be annoyed. So you might find that your relationships with people will change. So some relationships won't serve you anymore and you'll choose to move away from them perhaps. Other relationships you might find that you thought you had someone that was quite a good friend, but actually the relationship was more one-sided than you thought, and they might like the old version of you and not an assertive version of you. So relationships can change, people can change, you're going to change, so the way people relate to you is going to change. Some people will like it, some people won't, but the people that want the best for you will like it and they'll be cheering you on. So that's all about our false self, our real self, and how we avoid saying no, how we don't know that we want to say no, how we can get to be able to say no. This is another way that we defend ourselves, especially if we're chronic people pleasers. We're going to really struggle with saying no to people. So I hope that information was useful for you, and take care of yourselves. Bye.